The worst cold wasn't the kind that hit you fast, the kind that slapped your face and stole your breath the second you stepped outside. No, the real killer was the slow cold, the kind that crept in through chinks in the wall, bled up through the floorboards, and hovered just above the blanket as you slept. The kind that made a man question if he'd woken up blind, when it was just frost crusted over his eyes. The kind that cracked fingers and froze lungs, that turned wet socks into frozen boards and made firewood burn like matchsticks, disappearing in minutes but never warming the bone. The cold of a high mountain winter. And in the winter of 1836, that cold nearly killed Thomas Naught. Naught had trapped beaver up and down the Snake River for 4 years. He was a Virginian by birth, 32 by the time the story starts, and already worn to the bone like most men who stayed in the Rockies more than 2 seasons. He wasn't the strongest, or the fastest, or even the most clever trapper, but he was stubborn, and he listened. That last part would end up saving his life, because the way he dressed in November would not be the way he dressed by March, and the furs he thought were enough in early winter nearly sent him to the ground for good. The truth was, most greenhorns dressed for the mountains like they were dressing for snow, but snow and cold weren't the same thing. Cold had teeth, and Thomas Naught was about to learn how to layer fur like his life depended on it. It began with a misjudgment, the kind that kills men slowly, not suddenly. In early November, Naught had set up camp in the high country west of the Teton Range, a patch of timber near a frozen creek where beaver dams dotted the bends like stepping stones. The snow was already knee-deep in the hollows, and the days were growing short, but he'd found good sign, and the pelts were thick. He was working alone. His partner had taken a wound weeks earlier and turned back east. Naught figured he could run the line solo. That first week he felt fine. His setup was what most mountain men considered standard: a heavy woolen undershirt, a thick deerskin tunic over that, lined with rabbit fur along the seams. Over that, a buffalo robe, stiff but warm. On his legs he wore wool leggings wrapped with leather ties and topped with bear fur moccasins that reached mid-calf. He had a fur cap and mitts made from beaver hide. It was a rig respectable enough to impress at rendezvous, and had gotten him through plenty of frosty mornings. But that year the cold came early and came hard. By the second week of November, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 days. Nighttime lows plunged past zero. The frost line crept inside the cabin. It was a small shelter, built quickly with stacked logs, chinked poorly, with a dirt floor and no real insulation. He dug himself a fire pit just off-center, lined with stones, with a crude flue made from split logs and clay, but it smoked more than it warmed. And on the third night of that freeze, Thomas woke up shaking. His blanket was damp from his own breath, freezing and melting again. His fingers were numb, his feet had gone stiff. He staggered to the fire and found the coals dead cold. He lit another flame, sat hunched over it with his mitts off, eyes raw from the smoke. The fire wouldn't catch well. The wood was frozen and green, and that's when it hit him. He'd underestimated the cold. He had a rifle, traps, fire steel, dried meat, and a thick robe, but it wasn't enough. He could feel it in his chest, a tightening like the cold was wrapping its hand around his lungs. The buffalo robe, for all its bulk, wasn't keeping heat in. It was stiff, heavy, and soaked up moisture from the air. The rabbit lining helped some, but his sweat froze the inside of the tunic after he hiked. He realized he had dressed for the image of winter, not the mechanics of survival. The next day, he didn't run his lines. He spent it tearing apart his gear. He laid out everything he had, and started thinking like a man in a trap himself. No movement until you figure the escape. That's when he remembered something an old crow trader had once told him around a campfire. Don't wear 1 bear when you can wear 5 rabbits. At the time, Naught had laughed, thinking it a joke, but now that line took on new meaning. The principle wasn't about the animals, it was about layers. Bulk didn't mean warmth. Warmth came from trapping air. Every good fur trader knew that. The best insulation wasn't thickness, but still air held between fibers. 1 thick robe trapped some air, but 3 thinner layers trapped more, and let a man regulate heat better. Naught had been wearing thick to look ready, but sweating under it. Sweat was death. Sweat turned to ice when you stopped moving. Wet inner layers froze faster than snow, and once that happened, the body fought against itself, every muscle tightening just to hold on to a few degrees. What he needed was a new system. He began redesigning his outfit right there, in the snow outside his cabin. He started with a dry wool undershirt, the only piece that hadn't soaked through. Over that, instead of 1 deerskin tunic, he fashioned 2 lighter ones. One had squirrel lining. The other he stitched from scraps of muskrat he'd been saving. Both were short enough to move in but covered vital parts. Over that he layered a new piece, a waist-length bison vest, shaved thin, lighter than the robe but warmer. Then came a final outer coat, a reversible elk hide piece he'd bought from a half-métis trapper the year before, never worn because it looked too patchwork. That coat became his shield. For his legs he doubled his leggings. Inner wool, outer fur. He wrapped both with sinew lashings at knees and thighs, making sure no snow or cold wind could creep up. He wore 2 pairs of socks, one wool, one rabbit, and lined the moccasins with dry moss to wick moisture. On his hands, he stopped using the thick mittens except at night. During the day, he used 2-layer gloves, thin hide underlayers with open finger dexterity, and large fur mitts he could slip on during long walks. It wasn't just about what he wore, it was how he used it. The new layering system allowed him to shed the outer coat while working traps to avoid sweating, then layer back up while still warm. It let him dry one set near the fire while wearing another. He built a drying rack inside the cabin for mitts and socks. He learned to sleep in partial layers, never full gear, but just enough to stay warm without overheating. And most importantly, he learned to plan for temperature swings between movement and rest. It worked. Slowly, day by day, he stopped waking up numb. His woodpile lasted longer because he didn't need to stoke the fire constantly. His movements became more efficient. He learned which layers held warmth even when damp, rabbit and squirrel, and which froze useless once wet, beaver unless properly smoked and oiled. He discovered that muskox fur, which he got in trade from another trapper passing through, was nearly windproof when layered with elk, and that marten fur made excellent collars that didn't chafe the neck when breathing hard. In December, the cold got worse. It dropped to 25 one night, then stayed below 0 for a full week. But by then, Nort was ready. He moved through the trees like a man armored in air. He even started teaching his system to a nearby group of greenhorns who'd built a crude camp a mile up the valley. One of them had already lost 2 fingers to frostbite. When they saw how Nort dressed, they mocked him at first, called him a walking menagerie, but after 3 nights of brutal cold, they came knocking. He taught them how to layer, how to dry gear properly, how to line moccasins with cattail fluff, how to keep mitts dry using birch bark shells, how to sleep with a heated stone wrapped in hide under your knees, and why your core temperature mattered more than your fingers. He showed them how to think about heat, not as something you made, but something you trapped and conserved. Heat wasn't fire, heat was planning. By mid-January, Nort's cabin had become the warmest camp in the region, not because of a better fireplace, but because of what he wore and how he wore it. And the stories spread. Men started saying there was a trapper who could walk through a blizzard without freezing, who could sit through the night in a canvas lean-to, with nothing but a pile of rabbits on his back and come out alive. They weren't wrong, but by February, things would change again. A thaw came early, followed by a snap freeze that caught dozens off guard. Snowmelt refroze into ice, traps jammed, river crossings became lethal, and Nort would find himself stranded on the far side of the Snake with nothing but the furs on his back, and someone else's life depending on whether those layers held. What happened next would test every trick he'd learned. The Snake River didn't warn a man when it turned. It just shifted, quick and cruel, from frozen to fast-moving and back again, catching hooves and boots alike. By early February, the valley had gone through 3 false thaws. The snow softened underfoot during the day and froze like hammered steel at night. Tree limbs cracked under the weight of half-melted snow that refroze into crusts of ice. Streams ran black by noon and vanished beneath white silence before dawn. And in the midst of that deadly rhythm, Thomas Nort made the mistake of crossing the Snake alone. It wasn't foolishness, it was urgency. One of the greenhorns he'd helped earlier that winter, a 19-year-old from Missouri named Caleb Drury, had taken a fall while checking traps upriver. Dislocated shoulder, fractured ribs. Nothing instantly fatal, but he couldn't move far. He was laid up in a lean-to with 2 others trying to keep him warm, their own supplies dwindling fast. They sent a runner to Nort's cabin just after dawn, a boy barely able to speak through his chattering teeth, his face blue-lipped and raw. Nort didn't hesitate. He packed a sled with extra blankets, dried meat, birch bark tinder, and a half-dozen hides, fox, rabbit, beaver, already stitched into makeshift wraps. And then he set off, pulling the sled behind him like a dog team of one. The Snake was narrow at that bend, maybe 40 feet across, with thick snow layered over what looked like ice. But looks in the mountains deceive. He tested the edge with his axe, heard the crackle underneath, and should have turned back. But daylight was short, and Caleb's camp was 2 miles up the far ridge. He stepped forward, slowly, keeping his weight low. The first 10 feet held, then the sled creaked behind him. The ice snapped like a pistol shot. In an instant, he was underwater. The cold punched through every layer. The river didn't care about buffalo hide or rabbit fur. It ripped past them all. Nort flailed for purchase. His gloves floated off. The sled toppled, half its cargo spilling into the water. One of his moccasins tore loose. He grabbed the edge of the broken ice, but it crumbled under his hands. He tried again, kicking hard, lungs burning. This time he pulled himself halfway out, and then the sled line jerked, still tied to his waist. It dragged him back. He drew his knife and sliced the line. The sled vanished downstream. With the last of his strength, Nort hauled himself out and collapsed onto the bank, soaked through, chest heaving, hands bloody from the ice. He lay there for a minute, then two. The wind hit him like knives. His clothes were already stiffening. Hypothermia wasn't a slow death out here. It came in waves. First the shivers, then the drowsiness, then the silence. He rolled onto his side, forced himself to stand. Every step toward the tree line was a battle. His breath froze in his beard. His leggings were sheets of ice. The inner layers, wool and squirrel hide, had soaked through. But one thing saved him: the order of his layers. Though the outer layers were ruined, his core still had warmth. The fur vest beneath the elk coat had trapped enough heat that, once he stripped the soaked outerwear and built a fire, he could dry the rest without losing too much body heat. He tore pine branches for fuel, used a waterproof tinder pouch he kept tied around his neck, and blew smoke with frozen lungs until flame caught. Then he stripped, naked from the waist up, bare-chested in Subzero air. He turned like meat over the fire, rotating his clothing as it steamed and hissed. It took nearly an hour to get moving again. He salvaged what he could: one mitten, the inner leggings, a damp fox wrap he'd used as padding under the sled. He fashioned a makeshift sling for the gear he'd recovered, and then he marched north, wet, bruised, half barefoot, toward Caleb's camp. He made it by dusk. The greenhorns had given up hope. They'd wrapped Caleb in a threadbare blanket and were trying to warm him with their own bodies, but they were out of food, and the lean-to leaked snowmelt down the walls. When Nort staggered into view, frost clinging to his beard like spider silk, he looked less like a man than a ghost. He didn't speak. He just dropped the gear at their feet and got to work. He built a new fire from scratch, teaching them how to dig a heat trench beneath it to reflect warmth back into the shelter. He peeled off Caleb's outer clothes, soaked and near frozen, and wrapped him in 2 furs, then nestled him between heated stones pulled from the fire's edge. He fed them all, 2 bites at a time, and once they were breathing easier, he turned his attention to the lost gear, because now, with half his layers gone and temperatures dropping again, he'd have to rebuild, and fast. The next morning, Nort began stitching new garments from raw hides. It was crude work, done with frozen fingers and dull bone needles. But he worked fast, and he worked smart. He used muskrat for inner linings, soft, dense, excellent at trapping air. For outer layers, he used coyote and raccoon, mixing scraps to form a patchwork coat with alternating densities to trap varying heat zones. He taught the greenhorns to layer in 3s, base layer for moisture, middle for warmth, outer for wind. He taught them to dry their socks using fire-heated stones placed inside while they slept. He demonstrated how to build windbreaks from pine boughs and how to anchor hides with snow instead of rope to create makeshift shelters. And he spoke for the first time about the mistakes he'd made. He told them how buffalo robes soaked too fast, how rabbit fur worked better near the skin but needed replacing every week, how sweating was more dangerous than freezing, because once you were wet, the cold did the rest. He explained why heat loss through the head and hands killed more trappers than frostbite. And he told them about a man he'd met years earlier, a Cree elder who wore 7 layers in deep winter, none thicker than a rabbit, all breathable, all interchangeable. They survive, Nort said, because they think before they sweat. The greenhorns listened. They learned. They mimicked everything he did. By mid-February, the group had transformed. Their shelter had doubled in size. Their clothes, once mismatched and poorly maintained, now bore stitchwork from furs traded or scavenged. Caleb was healing. Nort had built himself a new pair of moccasins, triple-layered, inner bark insulation, outer hide double-tied with sinew to keep out snow, and word of his survival had spread. By the end of the month, other trappers began showing up, not just to trade, but to ask. They wanted to see how he layered, how he moved, what he used for mittens, for hoods, for sleeping. And Nort, who had nearly died just weeks earlier, began teaching in earnest. He explained how fox fur made the best hoods because of its directional density. The hairs trapped heat inward. He showed how to use beaver tail leather for elbow patches because they resisted wear. He revealed how to keep a fire ember burning in an antler hollow for long-distance travel. And above all, he preached layering as a philosophy, not just for clothing, but for movement, for thinking, for survival. "Don't bet everything on one thick piece," he told a trapper from the Flathead Valley. "Layer light, layer smart. You lose one, you've still got 6 more. It wasn't just advice. It was gospel, hard-earned. That spring, when the thaw finally held and the snake ran fast and free, Thomas Nort came down from the mountain with more than pelts. He brought a system, a way of thinking, a code of dress that would quietly spread through trapping camps for years to come. And though many would improve on it, few ever forgot who'd nearly frozen to death to figure it out. But the story didn't end with survival, because that summer, Nort met a trader passing through Fort Bonneville who had spent 3 winters with the Chukchi Chukchi people of eastern Siberia, a place colder than any in the Rockies. The techniques this man described would shake Naught's understanding of warmth yet again and send him chasing a new idea across the mountain frontier: heat retention without fire. The man's name was Anton Mirov, a half-Russian, half-Kalmyk trader with a pockmarked face and a voice like gravel rolling in a skillet. He arrived at Fort Bonneville in June of 1837 with a string of pack horses and a collection of trade goods that caught every trapper's eye, not because of their value, but because of their origin. There were carvings of bone in spirals unlike anything seen among the plains tribes, knives with handles made of blackened horn, etched with waves and suns, and most unusual of all, garments, cloaks, boots, mittens, thick but deceptively light, stitched from fur that looked familiar and yet somehow superior. Naught noticed immediately. He'd come down from the high country only days earlier, and his eyes were sharp from a winter spent relying on what he wore to survive. At first, he thought the garments were just well-tanned wolf or reindeer hide, but when he got closer, something didn't match. The hairs weren't like the flat, straight fur of any animal he knew. They were hollow, or at least they felt that way, and incredibly light. They rustled like dry grass when touched, but laid down flat when worn. Naught asked questions. Mirov answered in half-English, half-Russian, and long-winded stories of the frozen East. "These, my friend," Mirov said, holding up a pair of boots stitched with fine sinew and trimmed in white, "come from the land where cold is a god. Cold doesn't bite there, it buries. Chukchi make this: reindeer gut, inner layer; caribou hide outer, everything in between, snow cannot touch." Naught was skeptical, but intrigued. He asked to see more. Mirov laid out the full system on a plank table near the fort's powder store. What he revealed stopped Naught cold. It was layering taken to its absolute extreme, but with precision. The base layer was thin reindeer gut, almost translucent, used like silk to keep sweat from soaking into other garments. Next came an insulating tunic made of duff, fine underfur from reindeer or Arctic fox, compacted and quilted between two hides. Then came a mid-layer of caribou hide, hair inward to trap the warmth of the body. Finally, a wind shell, another caribou or even polar bear hide, hair outward, designed to shed snow, wind, and moisture like a roof. But the genius was in the integration. Every seam was sewn with sinew that expanded when wet and tightened as it dried. The boots had double soles with dried grass layers inside, changed daily to wick moisture. The mittens were built in two pieces, liners worn against the skin, replaced or rotated as needed, and outers that never got wet because they never touched sweat. More than clothing, it was a system of survival, and none of it depended on fire. Mirov claimed, and swore on the bones of his ancestors, that the Chukchi reindeer herders could survive nights at 40 below zero without building a fire, simply by how they layered, what they slept on, and how they used trapped air. Naught listened carefully. Every word was a revelation. He stayed at Bonneville for another 3 days, not because he had business, he'd already traded his pelts, but because he wanted to learn. He asked Mirov to teach him. The older man agreed, partially out of pride, partially because he saw the hunger in Naught's questions. They met each day near the corral, where Mirov laid out pieces and demonstrated techniques. "You think of layers like stack of blankets?" Mirov said. "No, you think like air in a box. The air is what keeps you warm. The layers just hold it still." He showed Naught how to construct a sleeping roll from 2 hides, hair inward, with dried moss packed in between. "This," he said, "is bed, roof, and coat, all in one." He demonstrated how to bind leggings with twisted grass rope that breathed, unlike rawhide ties that stiffened and cut off circulation. He even explained how to prepare garments by smoking them lightly over green willow to keep moisture from soaking in, a technique Naught had only ever used on moccasins. It was revolutionary, but what truly stuck with Naught wasn't the materials, it was the thinking. Mirov taught warmth like a trapper taught river flow, in movements. Heat rises, yes, but it also moves to cold like water moves downhill, so you build barriers, slow it down, trap it. He explained that movement was both friend and enemy. Too much, and sweat killed warmth. Too little, and the blood retreated from the fingers. The trick was to layer not just in garments, but in motion, slow effort, measured breath, never rush, never sweat, and always keep one dry layer sacred, never worn until sleep, never touched by fire or snow. When Naught left the fort, he carried no new gear. He couldn't afford Mirov's garments, and besides, he had enough knowledge now to make his own. But his mind spun with ideas. He spent the summer not trapping, but testing. He built a canvas lean-to on a high ridge above a tributary of the Green River. There, he recreated every technique he'd seen. He killed 3 caribou, dried the hides, and used the underfur to make his own duff layer. He stitched it between 2 thin rabbit hides, crude but effective. He made an inner liner from scraped deer gut, oiled with bear fat to keep it flexible. He constructed a new pair of sleeping socks from fox fur with grass inner soles. He practiced wrapping rope around his waist to compress inner layers without cutting circulation. He built a sweat shelter, a miniature hide tent, where he could dry clothing using only his own body heat and carefully trapped smoke. By autumn, he'd developed a full system, a 7-layer approach that weighed less than his original 3-layer setup and performed better in wind and wet. Each layer served a distinct purpose: moisture control, insulation, wind protection, thermal mass, and modularity. He even stitched symbols into each to mark their order, not for superstition, but because a single mistake could mean death. One day of sweat trapped in the wrong layer could freeze overnight and suck the heat from a man's spine until he didn't wake up. And then came the true test. That November, a storm hit the valley with sudden ferocity. Snow blew horizontal. Winds screamed like banshees through the timber. Temperatures dropped to 30 by sundown. Nort didn't head for shelter. He went into the storm, alone, no fire, just the system. He traveled 4 miles across a frozen ridge, carrying a load of gear in his new pack frame, light but packed with dried meat, traps, and extra gut liners. He slept that night in a snow-dug trench beneath pine boughs, wrapped in his own 7-layer roll. No fire, no smoke, just silence, breath, and the slow rhythm of warmth held by nothing but fur and air. He woke alive. More than that, he woke warm. It was a triumph, not of invention, but of adoption. He hadn't discovered the principles, but he had taken them, tested them, proven them in the harshest theater of the American frontier. And from that moment forward, Thomas Nort became more than a trapper. He became a teacher. Over the next 2 winters, he moved from camp to camp, not to trap, but to train. He showed men how to layer like the Chukchi, how to treat warmth like a precious, fleeing thing, something to be caught and held, not wasted in the smoke of a campfire. He taught them to see their clothing not as armor, but as an ecosystem, each part playing a role: inner breath, middle heart, outer skin. And men listened, because Nort had walked through death and come out with answers. He didn't speak in riddles. He gave instructions, specifics. Use gut under fur. Smoke rabbit lightly. Double up the moss in the hips, not the chest. Heat escapes fastest from joints, not from bellies. He mapped out temperature zones on the body like a surgeon. He explained how to stay warm, even when wet, how to survive a night if fire failed, how to pack a dry pair of socks under your cap so the steam from your head would keep them aired. By the time spring came, a half-dozen camps across the mountain territories had adopted his system. Men who once cursed the cold now walked with confidence. Accidents still happened: frostbite, falls, misjudgments. But those who followed Nort's system lived. That was enough. And yet, even with all he had learned, Nort hadn't faced his greatest test. That would come in the winter of 1838, when a desperate mother and 2 children arrived at his camp, half-starved, fleeing a raid. They had no shelter, no supplies, no warm garments, and the storm that followed would be one of the worst in a decade. Nort would have to keep them all alive for 5 days, without fire, with nothing but the furs he carried on his back and the knowledge in his head. The storm began as a curtain of snow so fine and dry, it moved more like smoke than flakes. The wind carried it sideways in whirls and needles, slipping through gaps in clothing and building in drifts against the base of trees. The sky darkened early that day, sometime around mid-afternoon, but not with clouds. It was the kind of thick gray that signaled something worse than a cold snap. Thomas Nort could feel it before he saw it. The air itself had weight, pressing down like a warning. The silence was wrong. The birds had gone still. The animals had burrowed deep. The pines stopped whispering. He was alone at his winter shelter, a half-dugout lined with stone and earth, roofed with pole beams and stacked hides. He'd built it into the southern face of a knoll, far above the river bottom where cold pooled like water. Inside, it stayed 10 degrees warmer than the outside, even without a fire. And once sealed, it was nearly airtight. It had served him well so far that season. But on that day, he wasn't thinking about his own shelter. He was thinking about what the wind meant, what it carried. Just as he was latching the outer flap of hide to reinforce the entrance, he heard something, not over the wind but beneath it, a sound that had no business being there. A voice, faint, shrill, carried on the gale. He froze, listened, then it came again. A child. Nort didn't hesitate. He threw on his outer parka, grabbed his snowshoes, and went into the storm. Visibility was less than 30 yards. Snow scoured his cheeks like ground glass. He moved by instinct and memory, navigating between pine stands and rocky outcrops until he reached the ridgeline overlooking the lower draw. That's where he saw them. A woman, bundled in what had once been a fine wool coat, now threadbare and crusted with frost, staggered through the snow, pulling a makeshift sled behind her. On that sled were 2 small children, wrapped in whatever scraps of hide she had left. One child was limp, face gray. The other was was crying without sound, mouth open but drowned by the wind. Nort raced down the slope. The woman turned as he approached, stumbling backward, arms raised. Fear, confusion, desperation. Her lips were cracked, her eyes wild. "Help!" she mouthed, but no sound came. He reached her, took the sled rope from her hands, and without a word, turned back toward the knoll. She followed, too weak to speak, too cold to protest. The children didn't stir. The return was slower. Snowshoes slipped. The wind pushed like a wall. But within 15 minutes, they reached his shelter. He cut through the drift that had already started to build at the entrance, unlatched the flap, and guided them inside. The warmth, such as it was, hit them like steam. 30 degrees maybe, but compared to outside, it felt like July. Nort went to work immediately. First the children. The girl was 5, maybe 6. The boy was younger, a toddler. Both were wrapped in hide scraps and some sort of homespun wool, but their faces were blue and the girl's hands were stiff. He unwrapped them carefully, stripping off wet layers and replacing them with dry ones from his stockpile. He had a roll of fox pelts, a coyote cape, and 2 squirrel-lined vests. He rubbed their limbs gently, not for heat but for circulation. Frostbite wasn't just about cold, it was about blood flow. Keep the blood moving, and you bought time. The boy barely moved, but he was breathing. The girl's fingers were purple at the tips. Nort wrapped her hands in moss first, not cloth, then placed warmed stones, swaddled in hide against her sides. Slow heat, not direct, never direct. That killed flesh as fast as the cold. Then the woman. She was past shivering. She crouched near the corner of the dugout, hands pressed to her chest, rocking. Nort gave her a strip of jerky soaked in hot water. She chewed slowly, eyes locked on her children. He wrapped her in 2 furs, muskrat and deer, and pulled his own outer parka over her shoulders. She didn't speak until hours later, when the storm outside had turned from screaming to moaning. "Raiders!" she whispered. Her name was Helen. Her husband had taken a small cabin near the base of the Wind River Range. They had 2 horses, a cow, and dreams of staying through the spring. 3 days earlier, a group of men, white, she said, not native, rode up under the cover of dusk, drunk, loud. They took the cow, ransacked the cabin, and set it on fire. Her husband tried to stop them. They shot him. She ran with the children before the house burned down. She'd been walking for 2 days. Nort said nothing. He nodded once, then returned to the fireless stone hearth, where he was heating a new set of stones for the children's bedding. The fire was small, just enough to warm rocks, not the air. That was the point. You used heat strategically, not wastefully. That night, he packed the children into his own bedding roll, the 7-layer system. He and the mother slept in a corner with nothing but pelts and fire-warmed stones between them. It wasn't comfort, it was survival, and it worked. In the morning the girls stirred. The boy coughed. The mother cried. The storm didn't let up. It turned into a 5-day siege of ice and noise. Snow piled against the dugout, sealing them in. Nort rationed the food: squirrel meat, dried berries, pemmican. He taught the mother how to dry mittens, using pine embers placed beneath a hide canopy. He showed her how to layer the children: gut in a wrap, then fur, then bark belt, then hide shell. He used every piece of gear he had. His own tunics became blankets. His spare boots were cut into foot wraps for the girl. He stitched a hood for the boy out of beaver tail and mink, double-lined and tapered at the chin. It looked ridiculous. It saved his ears. Each day the storm raged. Each night they rotated dry layers, dried wet ones, and rewrapped the children. It became ritual, system, life. By the 5th day, the snow reached halfway up the dugout roof. Air came through a vent pole Nort had driven up through the ceiling months before, a design he'd learned from an old trapper's journal. And without that, they'd have suffocated. But because of that single vent, they lived. Because of that and layers, when the storm finally broke, the landscape was unrecognizable. Drifts 10 feet high, pines snapped in half. The sky, a blinding blue, returned as if nothing had happened. Nort opened the flap and climbed onto the crusted surface. He could see 100 miles, no movement, no birds, just silence. He returned inside, looked at Helen and her children, and made a decision. They would not return to her cabin. They would come with him. That spring, Thomas Nort brought them east, slowly, carefully, through thaw and mud and swollen rivers. He dressed them in rotating layers, rewrapped hides every night, kept feet dry and fingers warm, and they made it, all of them. By the time they reached the Missouri settlements, Helen's children looked like wildlings, dressed in patchwork fur and hand-stitched leggings, but they were alive, more alive than any frontier child had a right to be. News of the rescue spread, not because of the storm or the raid, but because of how Nort had done it. without fire, without shelter, with nothing but the hides he carried and the methods he'd learned. That summer, he was offered a place at a fort school as a teacher. He declined. He returned west instead, said the mountains had more to teach, said there were still methods he didn't understand, because deep in the back of his mind was a memory of Mirov's last lesson, that there were tribes further east, past the Urals, who built clothing not from animal skin but from woven grass and snow mold, that there were techniques lost even to him, and Nort wanted to find them. Spring came slow that year. It didn't roll in like a warm tide. It crawled, bitter and tentative, peeling back winter one frozen layer at a time. But by mid-April, the rivers started to run again. Patches of bare earth appeared on the southern slopes, and the treetops shook off their ice. Somewhere down below, in the flatlands, green things were probably blooming. But up high in the Wind River timber, spring meant mud, melt, and wind that still carried a bite. Thomas Nort didn't care much for the calendar. He marked seasons by his firewood stack and the stiffness in his fingers. And that April, those fingers still cracked open when he balled them too tight. He left the settlements quietly, just before dawn, with Helen and the children watching from a cabin doorway. She wanted him to stay. There was land, they said, a widow's claim with his name on it if he'd sign it. Food, neighbors, quiet. But Nort couldn't sleep under a roof that didn't creak with wind. He told her as much with a nod, then turned and walked into the trees. No fanfare, no goodbye, just the familiar crunch of hide-wrapped moccasins over frost-stiffened grass. He was headed north that time, beyond the Three Forks country, where rumors drifted through camps about northern tribes who built ice domes not as emergency shelters but as permanent winter dwellings. He'd heard from Mirov that the techniques used by those reindeer herders had roots in practices further east still, that men in Siberia and Kamchatka built garments from fish skin and birch bark and could sleep on ice with nothing but grass and seal oil between them and death. Nort didn't know how much of it was true, but he knew this. Everything he'd learned so far had come from paying attention to what other men overlooked. The secret wasn't in reinventing, it was in adapting. That spring and summer, he made his way north through the valleys, avoiding forts and trails. He spent nights in lean-tos, tucked into thickets, often alone, sometimes trading with small bands of Cree or Assiniboine. He asked questions wherever he could, listened for details, bought or traded for gear that looked unusual. He wasn't searching for wealth. He was building a library of knowledge, one hide at a time. By midsummer, he'd assembled a small pack of experimental garments, some made by his own hand, others copied from native designs. There was a fish-skin vest, translucent and tough, layered over linen and fur, a hood woven from twisted grass and cedar bark, light as air but tight as cloth, snow boots stuffed with down from birds he couldn't name, and a sleeping shroud made from stitched strips of otter skin, sewn in overlapping rows like shingles on a roof, one of the few furs that could resist water and wind while still breathing. He tested each piece obsessively. He hiked with them on warm days to see how they breathed. He slept in them during summer storms. He submerged some garments in streams to test drying time. And more than once he burned his hands holding stones too hot, just to test which furs blistered or smoked. Every result was written in a battered field journal. Water-stained, worn, packed with notes. But it wasn't until September that he met the man who would change everything again. He was an older Métis trapper named Roland, thin as a whip and nearly blind in one eye. Nort found him in a half-collapsed cabin near the edge of a marsh, cooking duck over a fire made from peat instead of wood. Roland had been trapping in the northern plains for nearly 30 winters, and when he heard what Nort was chasing, he cackled so hard he almost choked. "You're trying to beat the cold," Roland said. "You're thinking like a white man, always fighting, like it's war." Nort frowned. "Isn't it?" Roland shook his head. "It's not war, it's courtship. You don't beat cold. You make peace with it, you give it respect. Then you learn to move beside it, like an animal moves beside the wind." What followed was not instruction, but re-education. Roland took him out into the bogs, taught him how to build shelters that sank into the earth instead of rising above it. "Down is warmer," he said. "Always has been. The animals know. You should too." He demonstrated how to make bedding from cattail fluff, layered between pine needles and bark sheets, soft, insulating, and replaceable. He showed how to layer garments with gaps in specific zones, back of the knees, inside of elbows, to allow heat to vent during exertion without shedding full layers. He introduced Nort to a new layering idea, zone dressing. Instead of thinking in layers that covered the body uniformly, Roland divided the body into heat zones. Core, limbs, extremities. Each had its own set of garments. The core was protected most, no compromise. Double or triple layers of fur, wool, or skin. Limbs were layered with more flexibility, shed or tightened depending on work. Extremities, hands, feet, head, were given rotating gear. Multiple mittens, multiple socks. Always swapped, always dry. "Cold isn't equal," Roland said. It hits you in spots. You don't dress for weather, you dress for failure. Nort absorbed it all, every sentence, every technique. They spent 6 weeks together, hunting, fishing, patching garments, modifying designs. By the end of it, Nort's system had evolved again. Now it wasn't just 7 layers. It was modular. It was adaptable. Every piece served a function and could be replaced or adjusted. He developed a chart in his journal, a kind of map for dressing based on weather, activity, wind, and health. On a cold, still day, core layers up, limb layers minimal, mittens swapped often. On a windy march, tight seal on core, vent at elbows and knees, heavier wraps on feet. During sleep, dry layers only, heat stones between thighs and underarms, no breath into bedding. Moisture kills, and all of it anchored in one principle: never sweat. Sweat was the enemy. Once moisture soaked into furs, they became heat sinks. Dry fur trapped air, wet fur pulled heat away. That single insight became the cornerstone of Nort's philosophy. He stitched it into his clothing, literally, carving the phrase, "no sweat, no death," into the lining of his parka. He taught it to others like a commandment. That winter, 1838 to 1839, would become one of the most severe in recent memory. Records from the forts described it as the long freeze. Buffalo froze standing in fields. Entire trap lines vanished beneath snow. And yet Nort didn't lose a single day to the cold. He traveled farther than he ever had, alone, sometimes with a companion. He slept in snow hollows, beneath open sky, inside lean-tos made from bark and snow. He documented every survival, every close call. He began assembling what he called the Field Manual of Warmth, a ledger of principles, failures, adjustments. He categorized furs by breathability, loft, moisture retention, wind resistance. He diagrammed garments, not just how they were built, but how they were worn in sequence. His system began to spread, slowly at first, then quickly. By 1840, men at Rendezvous in Pierre's Hole and Green River were whispering about Nort's code. Trappers who used his methods stayed healthier, traveled farther, made it through weeks others couldn't. Some scoffed, called it fussing, said it wasn't manly to think so much about socks and collars, but others watched and learned. And in time, even the stubborn ones came around. Because year after year, when the cold came howling and the snow buried traps and cabins alike, it was always the same story. The ones who layered smart survived, but Nort wasn't done. There was still one more idea he hadn't tested, one more rumor. A whisper from a visiting Sami herder, that garments could be made not just to trap heat, but to create it. That certain furs, when treated with herbs and oils, retained warmth even after being wet. That a man could charge his clothing like a fireless stove. And when a Chinook wind swept through the Rockies late that winter, bringing with it a traveling healer with a pack full of strange-smelling bundles, Nort followed him. Because sometimes survival isn't about what you wear, it's about what you prepare into the very fabric of your gear. And that was a frontier few had dared cross. The wind that blew down from the Continental Divide in the first weeks of 1839 wasn't the kind that howled. It hissed, low and constant, like a whispered warning. It blew warm, almost unnaturally so, stirring snow into steam by midday and freezing it into glass by dusk. The Chinook, a liar's wind, it gave false hope to tired bodies and tricked weak shelters into relaxing their tension. Trappers called it the knife in the wind because after a week of softening, the cold always returned with vengeance. And Thomas Nort, ever watchful, didn't trust warmth that came too fast. He was near the Milk River when the wind changed. The thaw had come in overnight, softening the crusted snowpack and turning dry powder into slush that sucked at moccasins. For 2 days, Nort made camp near a narrow ravine, letting the warmth pass while he dried every piece of gear, every hide, every stitched joint. It was during that pause that he encountered the traveler. The man was old, not in the way trappers age, rough and scarred, but ancient in the eyes. His name was Cam Took. He claimed to be from far west of the Pacific edge, from mountains that met oceans and tribes who built their shelters from bark, fishbone, and mud. He wasn't native to the Rockies. His dialect was a strange mix of coastal, Chinook, Russian trade words, and another language Nort couldn't place. He carried a bundle of herbs strapped to his back in oiled skins, and wore a cloak that shimmered like fire-washed stone, not because it sparkled, but because its surface never seemed to take on snow, wet, or ash. It shed weather like a duck's back. Kamtuk was neither talkative nor secretive. He answered questions if asked directly, but offered nothing uninvited. Nort offered him dried meat and a place by the fire. In return, Kamtuk unrolled his bundle and revealed not weapons or furs, but preparations. Bundles of root, bark, resin, and something that looked like ground stone mixed with fat. Nort recognized the lard. He didn't recognize the rest. Kamtuk dipped a finger in the mixture and rubbed it along the inside. seam of his cloak. Then he handed the container to Nort and gestured toward his own boots. Nort sniffed it. The scent was strong. Cedar, spruce pitch, something mineral and sharp like lye, but sweeter. He touched it to his own parka, an old fox-hide shell that had seen 3 seasons. It darkened slightly, but didn't soak through. Kamtuk nodded once, then made a gesture of warmth, hands spreading from his chest. And that night, in a lean-to, half covered in melting snow, Nort lay inside his bedroll and felt something he'd never felt before. Retained heat, not just trapped warmth. Sustained heat, like a campfire ember that didn't fade. The treated seam along his tunic radiated warmth longer than untreated areas. It was faint, but real. The next morning, Nort pressed the old man for answers. Kamtuk explained that the preparation was ancient, used by his ancestors to treat clothing in wet seasons when fires were forbidden or impossible. The ingredients weren't magic, they were chemical. The resin created a thin layer of water resistance. The root, some kind of mountain ginger, had a property that, when mixed with rendered fat and aged ash, acted like a thermal buffer. The resulting salve, when rubbed into seams or inner linings, prevented saturation and reflected body heat inward. Nort was stunned. It wasn't just layering. It wasn't just furs or technique. This was engineering. Together, over the next 3 days, they experimented. Kamtuk showed him how to boil spruce pitch to separate the resin, how to scrape root bark into fine shavings without releasing too much oil, how to mix the rendered fat at low temperatures so it didn't scorch. The trick, he said, was in the order of combination. Add heat too soon, and the mixture lost its insulating quality. Mix too cold, and it wouldn't bind to hide. Nort took furious notes. He treated a pair of moccasins with the salve, then soaked them in creek water. They dried faster than untreated ones and stayed warm to the touch longer. He applied it to the inner collar of a squirrel skin vest, then wore it through a wet snow hike. His shoulders stayed dry, and the warmth held through evening. It was, in his mind, the missing piece. Layering kept a man alive. Smart dressing bought him time, but enhanced layering. Gear that actively helped hold or resist heat, that changed everything. He began treating all his outerwear, boots, mittens, hoods, not the whole garment, only key areas, cuffs, collars, seams. He learned to mix in powdered charcoal for added windproofing. He tried adding dried moss for scent masking and found it helped with breathability. Each new variation went into his manual. He started calling it thermic layering, not a scientific term, just his own name for a method that combined materials, construction, and treatment. It was no longer just fur over hide. It was fur, layered over bark-treated wool, stitched with smoked sinew, and ice rubbed with a resin-fat root mixture that reflected heat inward and shed water like oil. In January of 1840, the system got its trial by fire. A young hunting party from Fort Hall had gone missing after a late-season push into the highlands. 2 days overdue, then 3. By the 4th day, a scout came stumbling back, frostbitten, half delirious, mumbling about a landslide and an injured companion still trapped on the far slope. Nort was there. He volunteered. He packed light, a week's food, a bedroll, and gear treated with the new mixture. He wore a layered system of reindeer underfur, raccoon hide shell, smoked canvas wrap, and a new inner layer lined with cedar-treated felt. Every seam had been treated. His boots were double-lined and salved. His mittens carried 2 liners each, inner rabbit, outer muskrat, treated differently for sweat control and moisture rejection. He found the party on the 5th day. 1 man had broken his leg, another had died. The rest were frostbitten, barely conscious. Nort set to work. He stripped the injured men, dried them with grass and moss, dressed them in rotating layers from his own kit, then built a windbreak from pine and snow. No fire, no open flame, just hot stones, body heat, and thermic layering. They spent 2 nights on that slope. Temperatures dropped to 38 the first night. The wind didn't stop. The next morning, Nort's breath froze in his beard. But the injured men were alive. One had regained full consciousness. The other, though quiet, no longer shivered uncontrollably. They walked out on the 3rd day, limping, carried, helped, but alive. And when they returned to Fort Hall, the officers didn't ask about bravery. They asked about method. What followed changed Nort's life. He began writing in earnest. Not just notes, but chapters. Systems, a full manual, the principles of frontier thermal defense. He wrote about fur selection, layering logic, material treatment, seam sealing, shelter integration, heat storage. He diagrammed the human body like a trapline map, zones of loss, of retention, of vulnerability. He included real cases, hypothermia, sweat shock, burn through from steam, all of it documented. He didn't publish it. That wasn't the way of mountain men. But copies spread. Scouts carried versions in oilskin rolls. Traders passed it between forts. And by the end of 1841, the Nort method had quietly become the standard for surviving high mountain winters west of the Mississippi. Still, he pressed further. By spring of 1842, Thomas Nort had begun experimenting with reactive layers, primitive but effective garments that adjusted adjusted based on moisture. Using bark fiber that tightened when damp, sinew that expanded, and layered membranes that could be opened or sealed, he created what may have been the first real climate-responsive trapper's suit. Hand-sewn, heavy, but astonishing in its adaptability. He could sweat and cool down, seal up, and heat up, vent and dry, all without removing a layer. But with innovation came challenge. That spring, an avalanche caught him above the Green River. He was alone, gear half buried, one leg twisted under a fallen log. 3 nights he spent in a snow cave, immobilized, eating dried berries and sucking warmth from furs he'd wrapped in the reactive suit. He survived, but barely. And when he crawled back into a camp 10 miles downriver, it wasn't with stories of death. It was with proof that layers weren't just garments. They were systems, that survival wasn't about brute strength or thick hides. It was about understanding heat, managing it, storing it, releasing it when needed, holding it when not. It wasn't a fur coat that saved a man. It was how he wore it, how he treated it, how he moved inside it. And as whispers of Naught's work began to spread eastward, toward armies, explorers, and distant governments planning expeditions into colder frontiers, one question began to circulate. Not if his techniques worked, but how far they could go. Because if a man could survive sub-zero mountains with nothing but stitched fur and layered bark, what else could be done? By the spring of 1843, Thomas Naught was no longer just a name whispered at rendezvous or muttered over campfires in snowy basins. He had become a reference point, a myth to some, but one grounded in results. The system he'd built, refined and nearly died for, had begun to ripple outward. Traders from Fort Laramie to Fort Vancouver passed notes to one another, sketches of garments, diagrams of wrapping techniques, annotations about which bark sealed best, or which combination of underfur and resin gave the longest radiant heat retention in storm camps. He hadn't written a book in the traditional sense. He didn't speak on podiums, but his field manual was multiplying. Every man who copied it added his own dirt-smudged fingerprints. Some expanded, some adapted, others misunderstood entire sections and paid for it in frostbite or failure. But the core remained: smart layering, moisture control, venting during movement, insulation by function not by weight, and, above all, the rejection of guesswork. You didn't wing it in sub-zero cold, you survived by system. And yet for all the knowledge he had compiled, Naught was restless, because he knew better than anyone that in the wilderness, nothing ever stays still. Gear wears out, cold changes form, and complacency is just delayed dying. So that year, he turned his focus not to trapping or traveling, but teaching. He built a camp in a protected valley west of the Bighorn Mountains, chosen not for its game or river access, but for its exposure to every kind of winter weather the Rockies could offer. The wind funneled through the gap between peaks like a bellows, snow drifted as high as shoulders, and sun, when it appeared, melted just enough to soak garments before freezing again at dusk. It was perfect, a natural crucible. By early autumn, word had spread. Men came from across the territories, young trappers looking to last their first winter, aging scouts hoping to fill gaps in what they'd always just done, even a few curious army engineers wearing starchy coats and jotting notes in small black books. They paid in trade, labor, or pelts, or nothing at all, if Naught saw in them the quiet desperation of someone who'd already buried a partner in the snow. He called it a circle, not a school. It had no walls, just a broad fire pit surrounded by hide-covered benches, a rack for drying gear, and several simple shelters made using 4 different construction styles: lean-to, pit lodge, split log, and canvas-draped stone. Each shelter became a station. Each station taught a system, and every man who came to the circle left knowing more than he'd arrived with. Naught's teaching was as practical as the cold itself. He didn't lecture, he demonstrated. He showed how to layer a body from the skin out, starting with the often overlooked base layer, which had to breathe even when coated in grease or resin. If the skin can't dry, he'd say, nothing you put on top of it matters. He revealed how bark-treated fibers, when rubbed with bear fat and cedar oil, could mimic modern oilcloth in water resistance while still allowing airflow. He taught the importance of redundancy: 2 pairs of socks at all times, one packed dry near the stomach under layers, the other worn and rotated, not because it was comfortable, but because failure in feet meant immobilization, and immobilization meant death. His mittens were a lesson unto themselves. He used a triple system: thin inner gloves made from scraped gut or squirrel hide for dexterity, mid-layer liners of rabbit fur or wool for warmth, and thick outer shells of fox or bear, often with bark lining or salve-treated seams. Each layer could be removed, dried, or replaced without compromising the others. Then Then there was sleep. Where most mountain men thought warmth came from the fire, Nort insisted it came from the bedding. He constructed multi-layered sleep systems that mimicked nest structures. In a cocoon of dry moss, wrapped in a down-lined fur shell, overlaid with hide tarp treated for water resistance. The base was as critical as the top. He'd dig shallow pits beneath the bedding to channel cold air away, and place heated stones in bark troughs beneath the sleeping form to radiate heat slowly through the night. But perhaps his most controversial teaching, the one that sparked argument and often mockery, was his total rejection of heavy buffalo robes as winter wear. There for show, he'd tell newcomers, gesturing at the massive pelts so often draped over horses or shoulders. Too heavy, too slow, too wet, they trap sweat, hold cold, and they'll drown you in a storm faster than they'll save you. Instead, he advocated for layered lightness, multiple thinner furs, each with a specific function, combined for versatility and speed. The bear doesn't wear elk skin, the elk doesn't wear buffalo. Why should you? Some men scoffed, others watched, and then the first blizzard came. It dropped out of the peaks without warning, as they often do. Mid-October, winds over 40 miles per hour, snow so fine it slid between layers like glass dust. Temperatures plummeting below zero by nightfall. Nort didn't call off the camp, he widened it. He sent men into the storm in pairs, armed with nothing but their gear and the instruction they'd received. They were told to survive the night. No fire, no canvas, just their layers, their stones, and their choices. Every man returned, some limping, some shaken, all exhausted, but not one had frostbite. Not one had failed. It was proof. And from that point forward, no one questioned the system again. That winter more visitors came. Traders, scouts, even a few native hunters curious about the strange gathering in the high valley. Nort welcomed all, learned from all. He listened to tales of hide tanning techniques using fermented bark in Shoshone camps. He studied Inuvialuit stories of single-layer garments that vented heat through stitched fish scale weaves. He traded for a pair of caribou fur mittens made by a Cree elder that stayed warm even after being soaked. Everything new became a footnote, an addition, an improvement. He wasn't hoarding knowledge. He was collecting it, refining it, codifying it into something a man could carry into any land, in any storm, and walk out alive. But as the circle grew, Nort grew quieter, not because he'd lost interest, but because the system had outgrown him. He saw younger men teaching newcomers what he had taught them. He watched mistakes corrected without his voice. He saw for the first time that survival didn't depend on him anymore. It depended on method. And so by the thaw of 1844, he began preparing to leave, not just the circle, but the mountains. No one believed it at first, but he started giving things away. Notebooks, treated hides, his original field manual, battered and patched, went to a young scout named Elijah, who'd arrived in rags and survived 2 full winters on nothing but Nort's system. The reactive jacket, stitched with bark and smoked sinew, was gifted to a Métis woman named Josephine, who'd lost her brother to exposure the year before and vowed never to lose another. He burned nothing, hid nothing. He walked from shelter to shelter, reminding each man of one final rule. You are your own fire. The layers only hold what you already have. Don't forget that. Then he packed a small roll, 4 layers, not 7, and left the valley under moonlight. No one saw where he went. Some said he went east to write down his work for soldiers heading into colder lands. Others said he crossed into Canada, searching for tribes that used bark and fish glue to create insulating shells beyond anything yet seen. A few whispered that he died in the snow, testing something too risky even for him. But others, those who had studied his method, knew better. They said he didn't die, he walked through it. Because by then, Thomas Nort was the system. Every layer he wore, every stitch, every treatment, it wasn't protection anymore. It was integration. He had become what he'd taught, a man who didn't fear the cold, not because he was stronger than it, but because he understood it better than anyone alive. They never found his body. Years passed. Winters came and went. Men aged. Sons replaced fathers in the mountain trade, and the old trapping grounds quieted under new laws, changing borders, and the slow crawl of settlement. The Rocky Mountains no longer roared with the chaos of the early fur trade. Forts turned into towns, trails hardened into roads. But in the high country, where snow still covered the passes deep into May, and wind still tore through pines like a blade, stories about Thomas Nort never stopped. Because everywhere there was a man who survived when he shouldn't have, someone always asked, did he follow the system? And more often than not, the answer was yes. Nort's teachings, though never formally published, were passed on like medicine. They were scratched into trapper journals, carved into cabin doors, whispered around fires. They lived in the kits of scouts who crossed the northern Great Plains, in the hide rolls of Blackfoot traders who'd watched him survive nights that would kill most men. men, in the packs of US Army officers preparing expeditions toward the Canadian border, where the wind never quit. A piece of his original system, the one made from bark-treated wool and squirrel-lined shells, ended up in the hands of an explorer named Bartlett, who led a survey party north of the Missouri in 1847. The party's horses froze in a late March storm. Men lost their packs in a river crossing, but Bartlett and 2 others survived 6 nights without fire, wrapped in gear they barely understood, quoting phrases they didn't even know came from naught. Don't sweat, vent the knees, keep your last socks by your heart. In 1852, a young French naturalist on a research mission near the Snake River came across an old Métis man wearing a patchwork parka lined with stitched cedar bark and double-thick rabbit fur. When asked about it, the old man said simply, "The dead man taught me. Long ago, he said fur is like a lung. It only works if it breathes." And in 1861, at the outbreak of the Civil War, a small group of Western volunteers assigned to a mountain outpost near the Colorado Territory received handwritten instructions from an anonymous sender. The instructions were titled "Layer Like Naught." They were crude but clear: diagrams of venting seams, recipes for salve, warnings about moisture, friction, and overconfidence. It was signed only with a drawing of a fox curled around a flame. No one knew who had written it, but every man who used it made it through the winter without frostbite. By then, Naught had become something between a man and a legend, not because he'd killed more beaver, or fought in more skirmishes, or stood taller than his peers, but because he had done the one thing every mountain man wished they could. He had faced the cold without flinching, and he had understood it, not feared it, not merely endured it. He had studied it like a scholar, fought it like a tactician, and walked through it like a prophet. But those who knew him, who'd seen him shiver and bleed and limp back into camp dragging his gear by his belt, they didn't speak of him like a ghost. They remembered the dirt under his nails, the calm in his voice, the way he listened to storms like they were old friends with new warnings. He wasn't a god of warmth, he was a student of it. And what he taught was something few men grasped until it was almost too late: that warmth wasn't just a resource, it was a strategy built, piece by piece, from the trappings of the wild: fox fur, elk hide, smoked sinew, hollow bird bones stuffed with pine needles, inner socks worn around the neck to warm while moving, then swapped dry at camp. Every item, every stitch, was part of a system that did not rely on fire, did not depend on chance, did not pretend that toughness alone could conquer the elements. Because toughness breaks, willpower fades, but systems endure. And so when young trappers set out in early November with their packs cinched tight and their coats treated with resin and bark, when they cut windbreaks into the north side of slopes or stitched fish skin linings into their hoods, when they wrote in their journals not just what animals they'd skinned, but how they wore them, they were carrying Naught's legacy, not as worshippers, but as practitioners. There's a story told in some old camps. No one knows if it's true, but it holds like ice on pine bark. That one winter, long after the circle had faded and no one had seen Naught in over a decade, a lone figure was spotted crossing a high ridge north of Yellowstone. No horse, no sled, just a man walking upright through head-high snow in a coat made from stitched strips of fur no one could name. He walked steady, even as a blizzard closed in around him, and when a search party tried to follow the tracks the next morning, they found only a circle in the snow, clean, precise, and undisturbed. No campfire, no blood, just a mark in the shape of a sleeping form, and a single word scratched into the frost with a gloved finger: warm. And maybe that's all that needs to be said, because Thomas Naught wasn't chasing comfort. He wasn't building fashion. He was solving a problem older than the mountains themselves: how to keep the fire inside the body alive when everything outside is trying to snuff it out. And in doing so, he didn't just survive the worst winters the Rockies ever saw. He made sure other men could too.